I was 79 years old when my son left me alone in the middle of the snow. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, cold, calculated choice. He parked the car on the side of a deserted road, opened the door on my side, and simply said, "Get out." I looked at him, confused. We were miles from anywhere. The snow fell heavily, covering everything with a thickness that seemed to swallow the world. The wind cut through the skin. I felt fear, but still I asked, my voice trembling, "What are you doing?" He didn't look me in the eye. He just repeated, louder this time, "Get down." And I went down. Not because I wanted to, but because, in that split second, something inside me already knew that arguing wouldn't change anything. He had already made the decision before picking me up that morning. Maybe even before that day. The door slammed shut. The car sped off, and I stood there, watching the taillights disappear around the bend in the road, swallowed by the snowstorm. Before we begin, if you feel touched by these issues and want to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new journey of transformation and self-discovery is shared here. Don't miss the chance to hear more stories from people who are discovering the strength within themselves. I didn't cry at that moment. I didn't scream. I just stayed silent, listening to the sound of the wind and feeling the wet snow soak my thin coat. My body trembled, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was from something deeper, a kind of shock that paralyzes everything inside. How did I get there? That question echoed in my head as I looked around, trying to understand where I was, where to go, what to do. But the truth is, I already knew the answer. I just didn't want to admit it. This didn't start that day. It started much earlier. My son was always distant. Since he was a child, he had a coldness that I never fully understood. He wasn't a difficult child. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't disobedient. But there was a hardness to him, a kind of invisible wall that I could never break through, no matter how hard I tried. I remember looking at him when he was little and feeling a strange sadness, as if I were seeing someone who had already given up on something, even without knowing exactly what. He never ran to hug me. He never asked to be held. He never cried in my arms when he got hurt. And me, I tried in every way. I did everything a mother should do. I cared for him, fed him, protected him, loved him. But it was as if none of that reached him. As if there was a layer of ice between us, and every gesture of mine slipped away without touching the bottom. Over time, I learned to accept it. I learned to live with that distance. I learned not to expect too much. And when he grew up, left home, and built his own life, I thought I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. I thought that, perhaps, time would soften that harshness, that he would find something or someone that would make him feel more. But that's not what happened. He got married, had children, built a life that seemed normal from the outside. But with me, the relationship remained the same, cold, distant, mechanical. He would call me twice a year, Christmas and my birthday, short, formal, empty conversations. I would ask how he was. He would answer with monosyllables. I would ask about the grandchildren. He would change the subject. In the end, it was always me who ended the call because he never had anything more to say. And I accepted it because that's how it had always been. Because I had already learned not to expect anything anymore. Until my husband died. Then everything changed. Suddenly, I was alone. Completely alone. The house became too big, too silent. I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel the weight of the emptiness. It wasn't just his absence. It was the absence of everything, of purpose, of meaning, of continuity. I tried to keep going. I tried to maintain the routine, take care of the house, go out to buy bread, talk to the neighbors. But each hade fell me leg a shed and grew weaker. I fell a few times, and each fall reminded me that I had no one left to lift me up. That's when my son appeared. He called, unannounced, and said he was coming to pick me up. That I couldn't stay alone anymore. That he and his wife had talked and decided it was best for me to go live with them. I was surprised. And, I confess, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Perhaps, finally, he was ready to let me in. Perhaps age, widowhood, frailty had awakened something dormant in him. Perhaps he had realized that I needed him, and that, deep down, perhaps he needed me, too. I packed my things carefully. I separated photos, clothes, small objects that had meaning. I closed the house where I had lived for 40 years. And when he arrived to pick me up, I got into the car with a heavy heart, but also with a fragile, delicate, almost childlike hope. I thought I was starting a new chapter, but I was wrong. In the first few days, everything seemed normal. He showed me the room where I would be staying, a small room at the back of the house, with a simple bed and a window overlooking the backyard. It wasn't cozy, but it wasn't bad either. I thanked him. I tried not to seem disappointed. His wife barely spoke to me. She walked past me as if I were invisible. The grandchildren, whom I barely knew, looked at me curiously on the first day and then stopped noticing my presence. I tried to help. I offered to cook, wash dishes, tidy the house. But every time I moved, I felt like I was getting in the way. My son hardly ever spoke to me. When he did, it was to give short orders. Don't touch that. Don't go out now. Stay in your room. I obeyed because I didn't know what else to do. And then, little by little, I began to understand. I wasn't there because he cared. I was there because it was convenient. He had access to my pension. My house would be sold. My money would be useful. And me, I was just a burden, a nuisance, an obligation. I began to feel something I had never felt before. Absolute rejection. It wasn't just distance. It was hostility. It was contempt. I saw in his eyes, when he looked at me, something that hurt more than any words could. He hated me, and I didn't know why. I started to withdraw. I stopped trying to help. I stopped trying to talk. I stayed in my room, quiet, waiting for the day to pass. I ate little. I slept poorly. And I felt, more and more, that I was dying inside. That's when he decided I shouldn't be there anymore. It wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. He came into the room, looked at me with that coldness I'd always known, and said, "Tomorrow morning, you're leaving." I asked him where to. He didn't answer. And the next day, he put me in the car, drove for hours, and left me in the snow. Now, here I am, standing in the middle of nowhere, 79 years old, with no one, with nothing. And the only thing I can think is, how did I let my life get to this point? I don't know how long I stood there, watching the snow fall. Maybe it's mes bonjours. The cold began to penetrate deeper, seeping through my coat, my shirt, my skin. My fingers went numb, my lips cracked. I felt a tingling in my legs that scared me because I knew it was dangerous. It was my body starting to shut down. I needed to move. I needed to find shelter. But where? I looked both ways down the road. Nothing. Just snow-covered trees. The wind howling through the branches. And that suffocating feeling of being completely alone in the world. There were no houses in sight. No lights. No signs of life. I started walking. Not because I had a plan, but because standing still meant dying right there. Each step sank into the snow. My feet were wet and freezing. My breath came out in white clouds. I was trembling so much I could barely keep my balance. And as I walked, my mind began to wander. I thought about all the times I had kept quiet, all the times I had swallowed my resentment, all the times she had accepted less than she deserved, because she thought that's what a mother should do. Endure, forgive, keep loving, even without being loved in return. But now, at that moment, something wasn't to transformation, like a small crack that slowly grows until, suddenly, everything breaks apart. I began to realize that I had spent my entire life waiting for my son to see me, waiting for him to love me, waiting for him to change. And in that waiting, I had completely faded away. I had become invisible, not just to him, to myself. I no longer knew who I was outside of that role. Rejected mother, widowed wife, old and disposable woman. I had spent so much time defined by the absences in my life that I had forgotten that, before all of that, I was someone. And now, there, in the middle of that snow, with no one to save me, no one to tell me what to do, something inside me whispered a truth I had never wanted to hear. Maybe I don't need to be saved by anyone. It was a small thought, almost inaudible amidst the noise of the wind, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something different. It wasn't hope. It wasn't relief. It was a kind of cold, almost brutal clarity. If I was going to die there, at least I would die knowing that I no longer had to carry that weight. I no longer had to blame myself for not being enough. I no longer had to believe that I deserved that abandonment because I didn't deserve it. I never deserved it. I kept walking. I don't know for how long. My feet were so numb I could barely feel the ground. My vision was blurred. I knew I was at my limit, but something kept me moving. A silent stubbornness. A refusal to simply lie down in the snow and accept the end. And then, suddenly, I saw something. A light. Weak, distant, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere beyond the trees, a little way off the road. I blinked several times, thinking it might be an illusion, but no, the light was there. I forced my legs to move faster. I left the road, went into the trees, stumbling, falling, getting up. Each step was a battle against a body that wanted to give up. But I didn't stop. And finally, I arrived. It was a cabin. Small, rustic, half hidden among the pine trees. The light came from inside, flickering behind a fogged window. Smoke was rising from the chum was there, ein auch première triette d'eau. My fingers were so stiff I could barely form a fist. I knocked again, harder, using what little strength I had left. The door opened. A man appeared. He must have been a wheat-graire, a femme, but candé. He looked me up and down, and his expression changed immediately. Surprise, concern, urgency. My God, he said, you're freezing. He pulled me inside before I could say anything. The heat from the fireplace hit me like a shock. My legs went weak. He held me and guided me to a chair near the fire. What's happened? He asked, pulling off my wet coat and wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. How did you end up here? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I didn't know how to explain. I didn't know where to begin. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to tell the truth. Because telling the truth meant admitting aloud something that still hurt too much to put into words. I got lost, was all I could manage to say. He looked at me for a long moment, and I realized he knew it wasn't the whole truth, but he didn't insist. As you know, Dad picked a mug with something hot from a friend, handed it to me. Drink slowly. I obeyed. Ituatia. Strong, bitter, but hot. I felt the throat. War mi chest, brindanamdi. We were silent for a while. He tended the fire, adding more wood, glancing at me occasionally, as if checking if I was still breathing. I looked around. The cabin was simple, but cozy. It had a bed in the corner, a small table, shelves with books and objects. It smelled of burnt wood and something that resembled soup. Do you live here alone? I asked, breaking the silence. He nodded. It's been about 5 years. Why? He smiled in a somewhat sad way. Because sometimes being alone is easier than being around people who don't see you. Those words hit me like a punch. Because that was exactly it. It was exactly what I had been feeling for years without being able to name it. I had been surrounded by people, but completely invisible. And now, there, in the company of a stranger who didn't know me, I felt more seen than ever. Do you have family? I asked. Either. Or I did. It depends on how you define family. He served a bowl of soup and placed it in front of me. Eat. You need energy. I ate. It was delicious, simple, but made with care. And while I was eating, I started to feel something strange. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Not the automatic, empty gratitude we offer out of politeness, but a deep, true gratitude that comes from a place of genuine appreciation. That man owed me nothing. He didn't know me. He had no reason to help me, and yet he was there, taking care of me, as if I mattered. Thank you, I said, and my voice faltered slightly. He simply nodded. We spent the rest of the night talking, not about what had brought me there, but about the thing. He told me about life in the mountains, about how he had learned to live with the bare minimum, about the harsh winters and short summers. I told him about the city where I lived, about the house I had left behind, about small memories from when I was younger. And for the first time in a long time, I felt present. I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't dwelling on past hurts. I wasn't blaming myself for anything. I was just there, alive, talking, existing. As night wore on, he prepared the bed for me and said he would sleep in the chair. I tried to protest, but he wouldn't accept it. You need to get some real rest, he said. We'll see what to do tomorrow. I lay down on that simple bed, covered with thick blankets that smelled of lavender, and closed my eyes. And for the first I slept on that night, when Première woke up for a daytime. Sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting off the snow outside and creating an almost blinding glare. I got up slowly, still feeling aching, but no longer desperate. The man was at the table, drinking coffee. He saw me wake up and smiled. Did you sleep well? Yes, better than it has been in a long time. He served me coffee. I sat at the table. We were silent for a moment, and then he said gently, "You don't need to tell me what happened, but if you want to stay here for a few days until you feel better, you're welcome." I looked at him, and ingratitude booted him something more. A realization that was beginning to form within me. I had spent so much time waiting for my son to see me, accept me, love me, and he never did. And the more I waited, the more I faded away, the more I diminished myself, the more I believed the problem was with me. But there, in that cabin, with a stranger who owed me nothing, I was being seen. I was being treated with dignity. I was being welcomed. And the difference wasn't him. The difference was starting to be me. Because for the first time, I wasn't bowing down. I wasn't apologizing for existing. I wasn't trying to be small enough to fit into the life of someone who didn't want to make room for me. I was simply being, and that was enough. Thank you, I said. I'll stay for a few days. He smiled, and we continued drinking coffee in silence while the snow outside glistened in the morning sun. I still didn't know what would come next. I still didn't know how my story would end. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future because something inside me had begun to awaken. I stayed in the cabin for 5 days. It wasn't planned. It wasn't decided in a formal conversation. It simply happened. On the first day, I was too weak to go out. 11 secondes. The snow fell so heavily that it would have been impossible to descend the mountain. On the third, I no longer wanted to leave, and something inside me was changing. It wasn't something I could easily explain. It wasn't a sudden revelation, a moment of absolute clarity. It was more subtle than that. It was as if, with each passing day there, layers of invisible weight were being lifted from me, layers I didn't even know I was carrying. The man, whose name was Daniel, had a simple routine. He woke up early, lit the fire, made coffee, tended to the firewood, and fixed things that needed repairing. He moved with a calmness I had never seen before. There was no rush. There was no anxiety. There was none of that constant restlessness that most people carry as if it were an obligatory part of being alive. I watched, and I started to imitate. On the fourth day, Première woke up and, without things started helping. Not because I felt obligated, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt like it. I wanted to do something with my hands. I want to prove any bout to myself. I started by helping prepare breakfast. Daniel showed me where everything was, how he liked to make the bread we ate in the morning, how he prepared the soup that warmed us at night. I followed the instructions, but I also added my own touch. I used spices in a way my mother taught me when I was young. I adjusted the consistency of the bread. I made small changes that seemed insignificant, but that somehow made me feel present. They made me feel that I was still capable of creating something. Daniel tasted it and smiled. It's different. It's better. Those simple words touched me deeply because they weren't just about the food. They were about the fact that I had done something and that it had value. It had been noticed. It had been appreciated. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden. At night, we would sit by the fire and talk. Daniel would tell stories about his life. He had been married for 23 years. His wife had died of cancer. The children had grown up, moved away, and gradually begun to space out their visits. First, they came every month, then every 3 months, then only at Christmas, and then they stopped coming altogether. They have their own lives, Daniel said, without bitterness. I understand, but I could see in his eyes that it hurt, that, even understanding, it still hurt. Aren't you angry? I asked. He thought for a moment. I've been there. For a long time. I was angry, sad, resentful. I thought I'd done everything right, that I deserved something different. But then I realized something. What? Waiting for people to change is a form of self-torture. They won't change just because I want them to. They won't love me the way I need to just because I think I deserve it. And the more I waited, the more I suffered. So I stopped waiting, and did he stop suffering? He smiled sadly. Not completely. The pain is still there. But it's different. Before, it was a pain that consumed me because I thought I had to do something to change it. Now, it's just a pain that exists. And I've learned to live with it without letting it define who I am. Those words stayed with me because that was exactly what I had done my whole life. I had let the pain, the rejection, the absence of my son's love define who I was. I had become the rejected mother, the woman who wasn't enough, the person who deserved to be abandoned. But c'est une tête cabane to begin to understand that. My son's rejection said more about him than about me. His inability to love me didn't mean I wasn't worthy of love. It meant he didn't know how to love, or that he didn't want to, or that he had his own wounds that prevented him from truly connecting with me. And none of that was my fault. For the first time, beauty in me body, feeling it in the body is different. It's when the truth descends from the head, crosses the chest, and settles somewhere deep inside us, where it can no longer be ignored. I started noticing little things. I realized that when I spoke, Daniel was truly listening. He didn't look away. He didn't change the subject. He didn't interrupt me. He looked me in the eyes and paid attention as if what I was saying mattered. And it did matter. To him, it mattered. I realized that when I moved around the cabin, I was no longer hunching over. I was no longer making myself small, trying to take up less space, trying to be invisible so as not to bother anyone. I walked upright. I breathed deeply. One existed unapologetically. I realized that when I looked in the small mirror hanging on the wall, I no longer saw just an old, discarded, useless woman. I saw someone who had survived, someone who had walked miles in the snow, someone who had chosen not to give up, even when it would have been easier. I saw strength, and that surprised me, because I had never seen myself as strong. On the 5th day, Daniel took me outside. The snow had stopped, the sky was clear, and the sun shone with an intensity that made everything seem unreal. We walked to a higher point from where it was possible to see the valley below. It was beautiful, silent, vast. I come here when I need a reminder, Daniel said. Remember what? That the world is bigger than the pain we feel. That beauty exists, even when it seems like nothing else exists. I stood there, gazing at that vast white expanse, and felt something stir within me. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was a kind of surrender. But not the surrender of someone who gives up. The surrender of someone who finally accepts that they can't control everything, that they can't make people love them, that they can't go back in time and change what happened. But I also felt something else. I felt that if I couldn't change the past, maybe I could create a different future. Not a perfect future, not a future without pain, but a future where I would no longer be defined by what I lacked, where I would be defined by what I chose to do with what remained. That night, we talked until late. I finally told Daniel what had happened. I told him about my son, about the abandonment, about the snow, about the fear, about the feeling that I had failed as a mother, as a person, as a human being. He listened to everything without interrupting. And when I finished, he remained silent for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't fail. You loved someone who didn't know how to receive that love. That's not a failure. It's a tragedy. But it's not your fault." I felt tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of despair. They were tears of liberation. As if, finally, I was allowed to stop carrying a weight that was never mine. And now, I asked, wiping my face. Now it's up to you. You can go back. You can try to rebuild something with him. You can look for other people. Or you can simply live. Live for yourself. Discover who you are when you're no longer trying to be what someone else wants you to be. Those words echoed inside me for hours, even after we went to sleep, even in the silence of the night. Who was I when I was no longer trying to be what someone else wanted me to be? I didn't know, because for 79 years I had been so many things to so many people. Obedient daughter, devoted wife, sacrificed mother. But who was I, deep down, stripped of all those roles? For the first time, I felt curious about the answer. I felt that perhaps it was worth finding out. On the 6th day, I knew I needed to leave. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew that if I stayed, I would only be postponing the inevitable. I had to return to the world. I had to discover what would come next. And I couldn't do that hidden away in a mountain cabin, however cozy it might be. Daniel understood without me needing to explain much. He offered to take me to the nearest town. I accepted. As I packed my few belongings, I felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, sadness, fear, but also something new, something I didn't expect to feel. Expectation. The expectation that perhaps, just perhaps, my story wasn't over yet. The drive to town took almost 3 hours. Daniel drove slowly, carefully, dodging potholes in the snow-covered road. I looked out the window, watching the landscape gradually change. The dense mountain trees gave way to open fields. The snow began to melt. And then, finally, signs of civilization began to appear. Signs, streetlights, scattered houses. I didn't know exactly where I was going. Daniel took me to a small town I'd never seen before. It had a main street with a few shops, a church, and a square. He stopped in front of a modest hotel. "You can stay here for a few days," he said, "until you decide what to do." I looked at the building. It seemed clean, simple. But the truth is, I didn't have enough money to stay there for long. My pension was in my son's account. He had access to everything, and I had left home with almost nothing. "I don't know if I can afford it," I confessed, feeling shame tighten my chest. Daniel shook his head. "It's already paid for. 3 nights. After that, you decide." I looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I want to do it." There was no arguing. And honestly, I had no other choice. Première accepted. He helped me out of the car, went into the hotel with me, and confirmed the reservation. The woman at reception gave me the room key. Daniel waited until I went upstairs, made sure everything was all right, and then said goodbye. "If you need anything, you know where to find me," he said. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, waved, and left. I was alone in the room. It was small, but comfortable. A bed, a table, a window overlooking the street. I sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time since everything happened, allowed the weight of it all to fall on me. I was alone. Again. But this time, it was different. Because this time, I wasn't feeling abandoned. I was feeling free from what? Quite no. But it was a strange, frightening freedom, but also full of possibilities. Because for the first time in my life, I had no one telling me what to do. No one expecting anything from me. No one judging me, ignoring me, belittling me. It was just me. And I had to figure out what that meant. I spent the first day just resting. Premier tout calmant away from also something deeper. I put on clean clothes. I ate a simple meal at the restaurant next door. And I slept On the second day, I went for a walk around the city. It was a small, quiet town. The people were polite, but distant, the way people in small towns tend to be with strangers. I went into a few shops, just looking. I sat in the square, watching people go by. Children playing, couples walking hand in hand, elderly, people sitting on benches, talking about things I couldn't hear. And as I watched, I began to notice something. I had spent so much of my life feeling invisible that I had forgotten what it was like to simply be present, without needing validation, without need to juste existing. And to exist, I discovered, was enough. That afternoon, I went into a small library. I don't know why. Maybe because I've always liked books, but hadn't picked one up to read in years. Maybe because the place seemed quiet, welcoming, demanding nothing of me. I walked between the shelves, running my fingers along the spines of the books. I picked one at random. It was about a woman who had started her life over after losing everything. I read the first few pages right there, standing, leaning against the shelf, and something inside me stirred. Because that story wasn't just about loss. It was about rebuilding. It was about discovering that, even when it seems like nothing is left, something always remains. You always remain. I took the book with me, sat in a chair by the window, and read. I read for hours. And when I finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Inspiration. Not the shallow, motivational inspiration full of ready-made phrases, but true inspiration. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, I too could do something different with what was left of my life. On the third day, I woke up with a strange feeling. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't fear. It was a kind of silent urgency. As if something inside me was saying, it's time. Time for what? I didn't know yet, but I decided to trust. I went downstairs, had coffee, and started wandering around the city aimlessly, just following my instincts. And that's how I ended up in front of a small shelter. It had a discreet sign on the door, "Volunteers welcome." I stood there for a moment, looking at the sign. And then, without thinking much, I pushed the door open and went inside. A middle-aged woman was behind a counter, organizing papers. She looked at me and smiled. "Can I help you?" I was wondering if you guys need help. She seemed surprised, but also excited. We always need it. Do you have experience with anything specific? I know how to cook, I replied, almost without thinking. She smiled even wider. Perfect. We always need people in the kitchen. You can start today if you want. And that's how I started. It wasn't grand. It was tout simple. I went into the kitchen, received an apron, and started helping prepare meals for people who came to the shelter looking for food, shelter, some kind of relief. And while I was working, something inside me began to ignite. I was doing something that mattered, not because someone was forcing me, not because I had to prove my worth, but because I chose to, because I wanted to, because for the first time in a long time, I was acting from a place of genuine desire, not obligation or guilt. And the people around me noticed. The woman who greeted me, whose name was Marta, thanked me constantly. The other volunteers started talking to me, including me, and the people who came to eat. Some looked me in the eyes and said thank you in a way that seemed to carry the weight of the world. And I realized that each thank you I received wasn't just about the food. It was about the fact that someone had seen them. Edgar had done something to alleviate, even if just a little, the burden they carried. And I understood. Because I had been that person. I had been invisible. I had been discarded. I had been left out in the cold, literally and figuratively. But now, somehow, I was on the other side. I was the one who saw, who cared, who made a difference. And the more I did that, the more I felt something changing inside me. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about the fact that, in doing so, I was helping myself too. I was rebuilding myself. I was discovering that I had value, that I had something to offer, that I mattered. In the days that followed, I kept returning to the shelter. The 3 nights I had paid for at the hotel were over, but Marta offered me a small room at the back of the shelter in exchange for work. I accepted without hesitation. It was a tiny room, barely big enough for the bed and a wardrobe, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had chosen where to be. I wasn't there because someone put me there. I wasn't there because I had no other option. I was there because I wanted to be. And that feeling of choice was powerful. It was transformative. I started to notice a pattern. On the days I woke up feeling grateful, present, and willing to contribute, things flowed. The people around me were kinder. Opportunities arose. Small good things happened. Someone brought me coffee. Someone shared a funny story. Someone offered help without me asking. But on the days when I woke up feeling heavy, dwelling on the past, feeling like a victim, bitter, everything seemed more difficult. People seemed more distant. Problems seemed bigger. Nothing flowed, and I began to understand something profound. The world wasn't changing. I was changing. And when I changed inside, the world around me responded differently. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was something simpler and more complex at the same time. It was the fact that the energy I carried, the state I was in, directly affected how I perceived things, how I reacted, how I moved through the world. And that, in turn, affected how people reacted to me. When I was open, present, and grateful, people were drawn to me. They wanted to be near me. They wanted to help. They wanted to connect. When I was closed off, bitter, lost in the past, people distanced themselves. Not because they were bad people, but because the energy I emanated didn't invite connection. It invited distance. And I realized that this had been happening my whole life. When I was constantly waiting for my son to love me, when I was constantly feeling rejected, diminishing myself, blaming myself, I was radiating despair, neediness, pain. And the more I radiated that, the more I received back. Direction more distance, more confirmation that I wasn't enough. But now, by changing my inner state, by stopping waiting, by starting to see myself as someone of value, by choosing to act from a place of contribution and not of neediness, things have started to change. People started to see me differently. And I started to see myself differently. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't linear. There were difficult days. There were moments when the pain returned, when the memory of abandonment hit me like a wave and left me breathless. There were nights when I cried alone in my little room, wondering if the wound would ever fully heal. But even in those moments, something was different because I wasn't drowning anymore. I was feeling the pain, acknowledging it, and then choosing to move on, choosing not to let that pain define who I was. And the more I became more complète, maître d'oiseau. One afternoon, a few months after arriving in that city, I was in the shelter's kitchen when Marta came in with a serious expression. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you," she said. My heart tightened. "Who?" He said he's his son. The world stopped. I froze. My hands trembled as I gripped the knife I was using to chop vegetables. The noise from the kitchen seemed to have vanished. All I could hear was my own heart pounding, racing violently. My son was here. Marta looked at me, waiting for an answer. "Do you want me to say you're not here?" she asked, gently, protectively. I took a deep breath several times, trying to find some clarity amidst the whirlwind of emotions that overwhelmed me all at once. Anger, fear, confusion, curiosity, pain, but also something more, something I had cultivated in recent months, a silent strength, a certainty that, no matter what happened in that conversation, I would no longer lose myself. I would no longer bend. I would no longer diminish myself. "No," I said, taking off my apron. "I'll talk to him." Marta nodded and accompanied me to the reception room. And there he was, my son. He looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes. His face was marked by a tension I didn't remember seeing before. Elukedat myen for a spas framtis, something that could have been relief, or guilt, or both. We stood there, staring at each other. The silence was heavy, dense, laden with everything that had gone unsaid between us for years, for decades. "Hi," he said finally. His voice was hoarse. "Hi," I replied, remaining calm. He looked around, uncomfortably. "You work here?" "Try." He seemed surprised, as if he couldn't believe I was there, alive, functioning, contributing, as if he expected to find the same fragile, invisible, broken woman he had abandoned in the snow months ago. "Can we talk?" "Asked." "In private?" I looked at Marta. She gave me a look that clearly said, "Only if you want to." I nodded. "There's a bank outside," I said. We went outside. The air was cold, but not like that night. Now, it was a tolerable cold. A cold that I knew I could endure. We sat on the bench. He stared at his own hands for a long time before speaking. I needed to find you," he said, still without looking at me. "Why?" My voice came out firmer than I expected. He took a deep breath. Because things aren't going well." I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. After that day." He paused, as if the words were too difficult to come out. "Everything started to fall apart." What started to fall apart? Everything. He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that shocked me. Despair. "My wife left me, took the children. The company I worked for went bankrupt. I lost my job. The house. They're going to foreclose. I lost everything." I didn't say anything. I just listened. "And the worst part," he continued, his voice breaking, "is that I deserve it. I know I deserve it. Because what I did to you, what I did." He covered his face with his hands. "How could I have done that? Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction. I wanted to feel that justice was finally being served, that he was paying for what he had done. But that wasn't what I felt. I felt something more complex, a mixture of sadness, compassion, and a strange clarity." "Why did you do that?" I asked calmly. He lifted his face. His eyes were red. "I don't know. I was so angry. At everything. At life. At having to take care of you. At feeling trapped. At feeling like I would never be free while you were alive. And that day, he shook his head. I just thought it would be easier if you disappeared. If I didn't have to deal with this anymore." The words were brutal, but I didn't look away. I didn't back down. Because, somehow, hearing it out loud was liberating. Because it confirmed something I already knew deep down. It hadn't been about me. It had never been about me. And now, I asked, what do you want from me? He hesitated. I don't know. I just needed to see you. I needed to know you were okay. I needed to ask for forgiveness. Do you want me to forgive you? I have no right to ask for that. No, you don't. My voice was firm, but not cruel. It was simply truthful. You abandoned me to die. You looked into my eyes and chose to leave me alone, in the cold, with nothing. You decided I was worthless, that my life didn't matter. He cried. Silent. Tears streamed down his face. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I took a deep breath. I felt the pain of that moment, of that abandonment, rising again. Butitin-swal. This time, I had enough strength to hold it back, acknowledge it, and not let it define me. I believe you feel it, I said. But that doesn't change what happened. It doesn't erase what you did. And it doesn't obligate me to do anything. He nodded, still crying. We were silent for a while. And then I spoke again, not because he deserved to hear it, but because I needed to say it. For a long time, I thought I had failed you. That if I had been a better mother, more present, more of something, you would have loved me. You would have seen me. But I was wrong. He looked at me. I didn't fail. You just didn't know how to receive the love I had to give. And that's not my fault. It's a tragedy. But it's not my responsibility to fix it. He lowered his head again. I forgive you, I said, and I saw the shock on his face. Not because you deserve it. Not because what you did was acceptable. But because I need to free myself from this. I need to move on without carrying this weight. So, I forgive you. But that doesn't mean I forget. And it doesn't mean you'll be a part of my life again. I understand, he whispered. I hope you find some way to deal with what you've done, I continued. I hope you can forgive yourself someday. I hope you learn something from this. But this journey is yours, not mine. I've done my part. Now you need to do yours. He nodded, wiping his face with his hands. Are you all right? Do you have somewhere to stay? Do you need anything? I'm fine, I replied, and realized it was true. For the first time in my life, it was completely true. I have a place to stay. I have things to do. I have a purpose. And I don't need anything from you. He seemed relieved and, at the same time, devastated, as if part of him had waited for me to say that I needed him, that I still depended on him. But I didn't. Not anymore. We sat there for a few more minutes. There was nothing more to say than he stood up. Thank you, he said, his voice low, for listening to me. For not sending me away. Take care of yourself, I said, and that was all I had to offer. He waved and left. I watched him walk to his car, get in, and drive away. And when the car's lights disappeared around the corner, I felt something inside me loosen, as if a rope that had been tied around my chest for years had finally snapped. I went back inside. Marta looked at me, worried. Are you okay? I am, I replied, and smiled. I really am. I went back to the kitchen. I put my apron back on. And I continued chopping the vegetables from where I had left off, because life went on. Mi life went on truly living. The following months were transformative in a way I could never have predicted. I continued working at the shelter. But I started doing more than just cooking. I started talking to the people who came, listening to their stories, sharing a little of mine. And I realized there was something profoundly healing about it, not just for them, because every story I heard reminded me that I wasn't alone, that we all carry wounds. We all face rejection, loss, abandonment, and we all have the choice to let these things destroy us or to use them to rebuild ourselves stronger. I chose the second option, and I saw other people make the same choice. Mata offered me a steady job. It didn't pay much, but it was enough. I managed to rent a small apartment, a place of my own, simple but cozy. I decorated it with things I chose, things that made me smile. And every time I went in there, I felt grateful for being alive, for having survived, for having found a way back to myself. I reconnected with Daniel. He would visit me from time to time. We became friends. Réal friand. The kind of friendship that demands nothing, but offers everything. Presence, listening, company, and I began to understand something. My life wasn't perfect. Far from it. I still had moments of loneliness. I still missed having a family, having grandchildren who knew me, having the kind of connection I'd always dreamed of having. But now, I didn't let that lack define me. I had built something different. I had built a life based not on what I lacked, but on what I had. And what I had was enough. It had purpose. It had real connections. It had dignity. It had strength. It had peace. And I realized that this was more valuable than anything I could have received from someone who didn't know how to love me. One day, almost a year after everything had happened, I was in the square, sitting on the same bench where I used to sit when I had just arrived in that city. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and I felt something rare, precious, contentment, not euphoric happiness, not the absence of pain, but a deep, rooted contentment that came from knowing I was exactly where I needed to be, that I had done the best I could with what I had, that I had transformed the worst moment of my life into a turning point, and I understood something fundamental. Life hadn't answered my pleas when I lived in despair, when I lived begging for love, when I lived feeling like a victim. But when I changed, when I stopped waiting for someone to save me and started saving myself, when I stopped living from lack and started living from contribution, everything changed. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was cause and effect. It was a direct reflection of my inner state manifesting in the external world. When I was broken, I attracted more brokenness. When I was whole, I attracted wholeness. When I lived in pain, everything around me seemed to hurt. When I lived in gratitude, good things began to appear. Not because the universe owed me something, but because I had changed the way I moved through the world, and the world responded. I looked up at the sky, at that beautiful sunset, and felt tears streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of profound gratitude. Thank you for surviving that night in the snow. Thank you for finding me, Daniel. Thank you for every person who crossed my path and showed me that I had value. Thank you for finding strength within myself that I didn't know existed. And gratitude, above all, for having learned that I didn't need to wait for someone to give me permission to live. I just needed to choose and keep choosing. Every day. If this story touched you in any way, I want to offer you something that also helped me a lot on my journey. It's a book about self-discovery, emotional healing, and the strength that exists within each of us. It's called The Way Back to Yourself, and you can easily find it by searching online or in online bookstores. It's not a magic solution, but it's a sincere guide for those seeking to reconnect with themselves. If you feel it's the right time, perhaps this book will also accompany you on some part of your journey. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing you're not alone. Today, at 80 years old, I know that my story didn't end on that snow-covered road. In fact, that's where it truly began, because that's where I died to the person I thought I had to be. And I was reborn as the person I always was underneath it all, whole, strong, alive. And if there's one thing I've learned, something I want you to know, it's this: no matter how old you are, no matter what you've lost, no matter how many times you've been abandoned or rejected, you can always start over. You can always choose to see the world differently. You can always decide that your story doesn't end in pain. It all comes down to choice, to courage, to the decision to keep going, even when it seems impossible. And when you do that, when you change from within, the world begins to change around you. Not immediately, not magically, but consistently, inevitably, because life responds to what you emanate. And when you emanate strength, wholeness, gratitude, purpose, life gives back exactly that. I am living proof, and you can be too.